Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO here at CalMatters, and we're really excited about the opportunity to have this conversation. This is a story that we all heard about in various ways early on in the pandemic, and I think a lot of people looked around and thought, really? Could it really be this screwed up? Could they have screwed this up this badly? Right? And then we started thinking about how to cover a story like this in a way that would not just tell people what's wrong, and not just, as our old editor Dave Lesher likes to say, it's really easy in journalism to make people angry at government, right? Just to cause, like, this is terrible, things are broken, look how horrible it is. But to actually do the journalism to understand what's going on and how to fix it, right? How to approach this longer term. And you've seen some of the work that we've done, that Lauren has done to dig into this issue. I'm really excited to be able to do this today in person. These live journalism conversations, they bring us a kind of a dynamic and a way that just another kind of journalistic interview doesn't, so it's really fascinating to be able to do. I want to welcome everybody here, both the folks who are with us online and the folks here in the room. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to get started and introduce the panel, and then we'll talk a little bit at the end about what we do. Lauren, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Neil, and thank you everyone for joining us today, both online here in downtown Sacramento. I'm Lauren Hepler. I'm a reporter on the investigations team at CalMatters. We are a fairly new team, but it is our job to dig into state secrets, always fun, hold the powerful accountable, and amplify the voices of those harmed by bad policies and practices. I will be hanging out. Also, I'll just do a quick plug. I will be hanging out after the event. We're always looking for tips on what we should look into next, or you can tell me in person, send us an email anytime. But we do have a big issue to tackle first today, and that is the future of California's job safety net. I'm sure many of you heard during the pandemic about the months-long waits for payments, the fraud that was heavily concentrated in a temporary federal program for self-employed workers. We'll cover the legacy of those programs, but if there's one thing I want everyone to take away today, it's that this is not over. We're at a crucial moment right now for finally fixing unemployment, but also other state systems run by the California Employment Development Department, much better known as the EDD. They also run our state's disability insurance program, paid family leave, all these systems that we're likely to run into at some point during our careers. And over the next 5 years, California plans to spend $1.2 billion on this overhaul that it calls EDD Next. As we speak, the EDD is using technology from companies like Amazon to fix phone lines, where as few as 1 in 1,000 callers got through during the pandemic. It's spending tens of millions of dollars with tech vendors, including Salesforce, on new online systems to track applications and verify identities after more than 1 million Californians were wrongly denied benefits during panic about fraud during the pandemic. But as we'll discuss, modernization has also been attempted before. This time around, we know how high the stakes are. Since 2020, we've interviewed dozens of Californians who took on debt, lost their homes. Some were forced to move out of the state, or like one construction worker I talked to in San Diego, out of the country. He now lives in Tecate, Mexico. And in some cases, this became a matter of life and death. We requested public data that showed EDD phone operators recorded hundreds of threats of self-harm during the pandemic while folks were in very dire straits. To help us make sense of what went wrong, but most importantly, the plan to make sure it never happens again, we've got a great group here today. Madeline May is a video editor and content creator from Burbank. In the summer of 2020, she found herself among the roughly 5 million people, that's 1 in 8 Californians, for those keeping track, who was ultimately impacted by unemployment delays. Daniela Urban is the founder and executive director of Sacramento's Center for Workers' Rights. She spent the pandemic triaging unemployment cases and facilitating a statewide group of advocates who are now weighing in on the planned EDD Next overhaul. Michael Bernick has kind of been here and done this. He was the director of EDD during the dot-com bust from 1999 to 2004. He recently consulted with the California Chamber of Commerce on a report about the state's unemployment challenges, and he's an employment attorney with the firm Duane Morris, LLP. This is a massive topic, so we're going to break it down into a few different segments. We'll start with the problems as they stand today after COVID, move into potential solutions, and then explore potential benefits for workers, for businesses, for the state as a whole. And then we'll leave about 15 minutes for questions, so please do save those for the end. Madeline, I want to start with what it was like to live through this. So sorry to everyone, but let's rewind to March 2020. Everything is shutting down. Millions of folks are losing their jobs. And for you, filing for unemployment actually seemed to go okay at first. Is that right?
Yeah, it started out okay. I was unfortunately let go because of the pandemic from the job that I had. So I was eligible for the full stimulus package, and I was able to apply and get it. And for a while, it was going really well until one day, I think it was in May, I want to say, I noticed that a bunch of my money was gone, and very clearly my debit card that Bank of America gave me was frauded because there were all of these random ATM withdrawals in cities I've never heard of, and all this stuff. So I called them and was like, "Hey, I was obviously something happened with my card." And like, "Okay, it's fine," and they refunded the money. And then about a month, maybe less later, it was frauded again. And so I called them and say, "Hey, I just got this fraud exact same way too." Also just random ATM withdrawals from different cities. And they're like, "Okay, yeah, that's all fine." And I never used that card again. After that, I basically just transferred all the money from the Bank of America EDD account to my normal bank.
So there was a time your account was negative, like $5,000?
Well, that's what I'm getting to. Yeah. So because I did get all that money back, so I took the money out, and so there would always be like basically $0 in that account. One day, a couple months later, I noticed that there was a negative $5,000 balance in that Bank of America, which was the amount of money that was frauded between the two cases that I had. And so I called them, and it took a while for me to get a hold of anybody that would talk to me. And eventually, someone said to me that they were no longer accepting fraud cases as real, I guess. And they were saying like that everyone was guilty, and that they were to assume that everyone that said they were frauded were lying and crooks. I remember one woman I talked to was very rude to me, basically assuming I was a criminal as I was talking to her, which was unfortunate. And yeah, it was devastating. I couldn't get any money from that. I couldn't even get the money to go to someplace else because each new amount I was going to got from the stimulus package just went to that negative $5,000 balance. So
I would say we now have some data on this. We know that Madeline was one of more than 375,000 people whose accounts were frozen. There's all the kind of mass confusion about fraud for a time. And like I said at the top, this impacted folks in really different ways. Some folks' housing impacts. And you had shared with me in your case that you had also just come out as transgender. So can you talk to us about what it was like to just survive this period, what that meant financially, emotionally?
Yeah, it's not my favorite time in my life for a lot of reasons, but I did come out as a trans woman in April, early April of 2020, basically right as the pandemic was happening. It was amazing because I did get to finally reveal to myself who I always was, but it was also terrifying. It was a whole new change in my life. I had to get all of these new things, clothing, products, all of this stuff to basically create a new life from scratch. So that was where the vast majority of my stimulus package was going, was to get these things that I now needed for this new life. And when this all happened, like basically a few months into my transition, like I was devastated. I was calling between Bank of America and EDD 2-3 hours a day, trying to get a hold of anybody. Sometimes I'd be on the phone for 3 hours and they just hang up on me. And I had to do a GoFundMe to pay rent for one of my months, and thankfully it did happen. I was able to pay rent that month. But no, it was absolutely devastating, and nobody wanted to give me like a clear answer. I think one person eventually said like, "Oh, in 90 days we'll give you an answer about your case." This was after like 3 months already, so it was like 9 months from when I finally got somebody to answer me on the phone. And after 90 days, called them again. They said, oh, there's no such thing as a 90-day thing. I don't know who told you that. Yeah, it was an absolute nightmare situation. I was fortunate to finally get the money back after a long, long time because I got some advice to call my local representatives in Burbank, and I talked to some other organizations, and I think that's the only reason I really got anything back was that I just made a lot of noise. And then finally one day they're like, oh, here's the money. No, just that's it. That's all they did. Here's the money. Okay, bye.
Sounds like a lot to handle at once. We
Yes.
appreciate you sharing your
Yeah, of
experience.
course,
And
of course.
Daniela, you were kind of in the trenches dealing with a lot of cases. These are complex cases. They vary a lot. And one point you've made in our conversations is that unemployment was created after the Great Depression. It's not necessarily set up to deal with the challenges of today's workforce. Can you elaborate on that? And then also what you see as sort of the biggest issues to address now?
So we spoke to workers during the pandemic, and I think it's easy to focus just on the pandemic and what we learned from the last 3 years. But we really try to focus on the bigger picture of unemployment insurance and how it was developed and why. And it remains a critical safety net for the working class community and those who don't control their own job stability. And it is still as important as it was when it was created, if not more, given the wage inequities that we have in California. And so we want to make sure that that program remains and remains stable for a long time. So when we think back to how it was created and the differences in our workforce, you know, we have better gender equity in our workforce now. We have better rates of higher education. We have immigration changes that have changed our workforce, technology, disability rights. All of these have changed the way people engage with their employers and with the workforce. And I think that's an important element to consider when we're looking at why the unemployment insurance system doesn't work for us anymore. And what are the challenges that are built into the framework of the system that prevent those barriers. So there's less than 50% of those who are unemployed actually access unemployment insurance. California has a higher rate than other states, but we're still well below 50%, and we've always been, at least for the recent history. And what are those barriers for that 50%? Why don't they have those safety net protections that they may need in order to continue to support themselves and prevent the devastating harms of job loss? So those are the things that we look towards in terms of, you know, what needs to be fixed.
And one challenge right now, I'm curious to get both Michael and Daniela's opinions on this, but we'll start with you, Daniela. There's a problem right now, sort of a financial quicksand underneath the entire unemployment system. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether it seems like this will be the year we'll, you know, finally address some of these things or where that all stands?
Yeah, I think, you know, we want to make sure that the system is stable. And in order to do that, it needs to be funded. And California has not addressed the solvency issue of the unemployment insurance fund for many decades. And this has resulted in an unstable framework. So we continue to borrow money and rely on the federal government to bail us out in times of crisis and to make sure benefits are paid. That's what we did during the pandemic. We're going to keep paying for it for many years to come. And we need to fix that problem. And that relates similarly to our benefits rates. The amount that workers receive for weekly benefits is also too low. It also hasn't been increased in a decade. And it also doesn't reflect our current workforce and our current economic conditions. So while minimum wage increases and wages overall in California continue to go up, the amount that you receive in unemployment insurance hasn't increased since 2014. So there's a real disparity there in terms of the amount of changes that need to happen to the system to make it viable.
Yeah, and I mean, Michael, is this deja vu for you? Like when you were the director in the early 2000s, there was also a lot of conversation about benefit levels, the funding structure. What's your take on what makes it different this time around? Yeah, perfect.
Good. There are really three key issues with UI. One, as Madeline points out, your experience is just the operation of the system. It was completely overwhelmed. Now, EDD, back in the early 2000s, this is back in 2003, started a modernization program. Governor Davis approved 60 million. And over the next 15, 16 years, it was done in parts, but never really completed before the system was overwhelmed completely by the number of applicants. So one is the modernization. You don't have a benefit system, you don't have a UI system unless you can answer the phones. And as Madeline described, that's the key thing. And EDD is on this, and we're going to go in and talk about what EDD is doing next. But that's a big issue. So the next big issue is the funding. So back in the early 2000s again, the fund was flush. We had a $6.5 billion surplus. So there is the decision then, the unemployment was maximum that was about 270 a week, 270 a week. So there was a decision made to increase that to the current 450 over a 4-year period, and also increased the wage replacement rate from 38% to 50%. So that was good. You know, the workers got more money. It had been a very low rate, but we never increased the other side in terms of the amount of money coming in. And within a period of time, that $6.5 billion reserve went down. And then we come to the pandemic. So the pandemic, the system's not in bad shape before the pandemic. So the pandemic, we now have anyone have a guess on what the current deficit is in the fund? 20 billion, you're right. It's estimated about 20 billion, and it's expected to go up. So we now have a deficit in this state with our unemployment insurance fund of $20 billion. Now you say, well, we'll take care of it. But it has a number of negative effects, particularly on employers. Because what it means, the state is covering that deficit by borrowing from the federal government. But there's no free lunch. Here at CalMatters, there's a free lunch, but there's no free lunch. So what the state is doing is paying interest, somewhere around 300 to 400 million a year, out of the general fund. It's crazy. So we have this deficit. We're paying interest on it to the federal government. We're taking 300 million plus out of the general fund, and you know that's money that, and employers are being charged more. There's a surtax on employers to pay off some of that deficit. So there's the answering the phones for Madeline. There's your point about the health of the fund. And there, of course, there's fraud, which we'll get into. Now, EDD is addressing that. It's addressing the answering Madeline's phone call issue. But the fund issue remains out there. And finally, I'd say we have, having been in this system for 50 years now, I can tell you, it still remains far too complex. You make one mistake, you put the wrong period in it, and you're stopped in the system. So it's far too complex to operate. It's far too adversarial between employers and workers. It was meant, you mentioned, starting in the 30s, it was meant as a reemployment system. Now, EDD is addressing this too, but it really in recent years hasn't functioned well as a reemployment system.
Yeah.
So
I
there are a
appreciate
number
it.
of issues.
Did you have a point, Madeline?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, you're talking about needing more people to answer the phones, which I absolutely agree with you. But I just also want to stress that I did get a hold of people. It took a while. I did get a hold of people, but none of them would give me an answer, and they kept redirecting me to like other places. Like EDD kept sending me to Bank of America, and Bank of America kept sending me to EDD. I think this happened like maybe 10 times between all these phone calls until finally, to me, I just felt like I was getting the runaround, like nobody wanted to admit the problem, and it felt like everyone else was just trying to get it,
Say something
blame it
on
on
that.
someone else. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
EDD, we have a number of benefit systems in this state. We have TANF, we have Social Security, we have SSDI. EDD is by far, UI is by far the most complex. It's set by it's heavily rule bound, and these are very complex rules. So I think people are trying their best, but you're hiring a lot of new people who have, haven't been there for a time. And I don't think, Madeline, though, the issue is so much hiring more people to answer the phones. That's part of it. But part of it is this technology, EDD next. You need a different system.
Yeah, Daniela, and then we'll move on to
So that
EDD
you're not on the
next.
phone for 90 minutes.
Yeah, and I agree with what you were saying about the unemployment insurance system and how complicated it is. And I think simplifying the system, especially given the technologies we have now to process applications and to process certifications, can allow us to make those changes in law that would simplify the program and let EDD administer it in an easier way. But it's also a very different program from the other benefits programs you were mentioning. It's not considered a public benefit. It is not based on income eligibility. You don't have to be poor to access unemployment insurance. Our highest wage earners can access unemployment insurance. It is a safety net for our economy. It benefits employers as much as it does those workers, because those workers are able to stay in the workforce, not be focusing on their financial loss, not be struggling to maintain housing and food day to day, but be able to be looking for a new job and be accessing new resources. But I do think this is another area where the systems can be improved. We have the California Training Benefit Program, which is a part of what EDD administers, that allows people to change industries while they're unemployed, but it's difficult to access. It's not streamlined as part of the regular UI system. And we see people who need to change industries, especially with the growth of AI and other technologies, where people are going to be shifting what they do because whole industries are going to be eliminated. And having a system that better allows for that will allow workers to be able to navigate the periods where they have more or less work while maintaining a basic level of economic stability that provides that safety net that we look for.
Yeah, so I think we've established there's a range of problems that are very much in motion right now. There is tension about who pays for some of this, employer taxes, general fund, that these are all things to still be decided. But I want to turn now to the solutions. We've talked about EDD Next, this big 5-year, $1.2 billion plan. And you might also notice we don't have a current leader from EDD here on the stage today. We did ask them to join and they declined. So you get me instead. But the good news is I just interviewed their director, Nancy Farias, and some of the highlights are 5 years, $1.2 billion. The thing they say that's going to be different this time around is that it's a modular program. So instead of let's give Deloitte, like after the Great Recession, a big chunk of money to fix everything, they've broken it down into dozens of smaller upgrades. Still, they're big things to tackle, though, like this phone system that was just so challenging for so many people to deal with. That's in motion now. They say you should start seeing changes in how that system operates, like within this year. There was a new online system to sort of track your case through the process that started to be rolled out last year that relies on tens of millions of dollars worth of Salesforce tech, among other technologies. And for Madeline and others who dealt with Bank of America and the state's debit card system, there's also news. The state recently announced that they're going to be switching over to a company called Money Network. It's not a traditional bank like Bank of America, but they're supposed to be rolling out a new direct deposit option in the coming months. It is worth noting, though, Money Network was the state's provider on a middle-class tax refund, if anyone got those debit cards in the mail during COVID. And there were some fraud issues with that as well, which brings us to this sort of tension around fraud technology. So the California Legislative Analyst Office is one group who has said, we know that fraud was a big issue during the pandemic. It was very concentrated in this temporary federal program. And they say that the state has overcorrected a bit and spent a lot of money on technology that's actually not very good at distinguishing between real people and fraudsters. So expect that to continue to be a very active conversation in the months to come. But I also want to turn to Daniela, because you work with a network of unemployment advocates from around the state who are meeting with EDD to talk about EDD Next. I mean, how is it going from where you sit?
Yeah, I think it's early, so I reserve my criticism for later. But so far, I think EDD is taking a really smart approach. They're looking at it holistically And as you said, modularly, but also in terms of building a whole house. So thinking about the electrical and plumbing and foundation and all of the different elements that need to be built into it, and making sure those are all aligned. They are not thinking of it just as a technology upgrade. So in comparison to some of the efforts in previous times at EDD, where they're really looking on to build a technology over an existing system, they're using EDD Next to revise the system overall and using technology as its method to do that. So we've long dealt with changes that we've proposed to EDD or they've proposed that simply are not feasible given their current constraints and technology. And this allows them to consider all of those changes that they can make as they build out the technology components. So what is the best method for phones to be answered and routed, and who gets those phone calls, and what's the language capacity, and what's the way that people get these complicated questions answered. So they're dealing with the system overall, and we're hugely in support of that. I think as we've looked at other states and how they've implemented these modernization programs, the best states are those that have engaged advocates in the process to give feedback throughout about how they're proceeding and what they can do and what they can't do. And so I think that that is similarly something that we have worked with EDD on, and we continue to hope to be engaged in that process. And I think that there's also the opportunity, not for everyone to just sit back and let EDD handle it. Even though EDD Next is being administered by EDD and it crosses many of their departments, as community members, as members of the legislature, as those who understand and have dealt with the department, we're able to do things to support EDD in this effort. So from the legislative perspective, making sure that we are simplifying the rules that we need to make the process more streamlined. Making sure eligibility guidelines are expanded and changed so that more people are eligible, to clarify the differences between programs, to allow better access to training programs and other specialty programs of the department. There's always this tension, and maybe Michael can talk about it from his experience, between the efficiency of the internal procedures that EDD implements and the ease of access for claimants. So we represent low-wage workers, we represent people who have language and technology barriers to accessing. So we're dealing with that small, maybe 5% of claimants who aren't going to use a mobile app. They're not going to be able to communicate over an online portal. So making sure that phone lines and paper options, in-person options remain available is an important component to making sure that we're not just relying on the technology, but looking at the process overall.
Yeah, that is an important point too. There are some low-tech elements of this, like EDD's redesigning its most used forms right now. So that's something you might also hear about in the coming months. But Michael, on that point, so obviously we're not inside right now launching EDD Next, but you were at the agency, like you alluded to, during another of these large-scale tech modernization projects. What are the hurdles to actually bringing these plans to life, and what's your take on what you're hearing so far about EDD Next?
Well, I left somewhat soon after the modernization back in 2004 started. It's one of the great mysteries of Sacramento in the last 40 years, why the state can never get any of these technology projects right. I think this next EDD Next will be an exception, and I'll go into that. But it's not only the EDD modernization in the first couple decades. We had DMV. The state couldn't do that technology project correctly. We had social service and TANF. The state couldn't do that one. So it's one of the great mysteries. Somebody's going to, I haven't figured it out, but somebody at CalMatters is going to figure out why it is in this state we can't get these technology projects going.
I don't know. We don't have Silicon Valley here. It makes no sense.
There's some reason. But in any event, on this EDD Next, so as you point out, Lauren, it's a $1.2 billion, so it's generously funded. It's a 5-year project. I think they've got it right. I think that's less of an issue. You're right, Daniela, it's early stage. It's good you're involved, continuing to do it. I think that's proceeding well.
What makes you optimistic? Why do you say this is the
Well,
right?
it's some of the points that Danielle made. It's modular. It's building, it's working with the advocates, it's building on experience, it's bringing in a new team. Amazon's now, Amazon Web Service is part of it, Salesforce. So they should have a pretty sophisticated team. So I think that'll go well. And as I say, that is the single most important. You have to answer the darn phones. If you don't do that,
Right.
everything else doesn't count.
Well, I mean, to that end, Madeline, you just got like a too close and personal look at how the system works. What do you make of the types of things we're talking about?
Yeah, to be frank, it doesn't seem like a solution at all to me. I'm sorry to say. I do try to look and speak to all the parties in good faith, but my experience with Bank of America and EDD, and I will say more Bank of America, I think, than EDD, was that the problem wasn't the lack of technology or the lack of staff. My feeling was that a deliberate decision was being made somewhere, because every time I talked to somebody, they kept sending me to all of these different places and talking to all these different people. And when you tell me how many people were in my similar position, having similar stories as me, it makes it feel like it would be weird that nobody would have an answer or be able to provide me and other people with an answer. Like, I think back to when I was first frauded and made that call, and they said it's fine, and they gave me the money back. But then a month later, they took it away. Like, somebody made that decision to say, oh, we've changed our mind. We're going to take that $5,000 away from you now. So I guess to me, I feel like the problem is just in someone's deciding that this is what needs to happen, that we just need to not believe everybody, or we need to, and again, I hate to be cynical about these things, but to me, like, the wait on the phone lines, the other stuff that I deal with felt almost like part of their process to get, like, and again, I don't want to speak, I know that's
This
not.
lack of
yeah.
trust, though, I will
But
say,
yeah,
is
that's
a
kind of how, like,
recurring.
whether that's true or not, it's how I feel. Like, the card, they told me when I said I think my card got frauded, like, I remember having a conversation with somebody saying, that's impossible. Nobody can fraud our cards. We have the best cards, all of this stuff. And then I find out that the cards were actually very easily frauded and were not the best.
They did not have a standard security chip that a lot of consumer cards that we all have. So there are specific things like that have emerged. But Mike, I'm curious.
The Money Network cards will have those.
Yes, the new cards will have them. The Bank of America ones do now as well. Those were added during the pandemic. But Mike, I'm curious, when you said, like, that's not the intent, what is your reaction like to hear that there is this kind of like disillusionment or distrust?
I think CalMatters will tell you the usual explanation for Sacramento here, it's not sort of intentional, so forth. You can never underestimate incompetence, in terms of a lot of this. A lot of the people, there was very quick hiring, a very complex benefit system. And so I've heard this, I volunteered with people who were, had EDD issues. People would just call me. I do this TV stuff in the Bay Area, and people would just call me out of the blue. And so I went through, I tried to help them walk through. And almost all the cases were like yours. Well, somebody told me this, or I had to wait 3 hours and so forth. So I don't think it was so much intentional. I think it was just the system was completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, and it is worth noting, I've talked to folks inside EDD, they said there was this kind of like shock and horror in the early days. Like, the job losses we saw blew any estimates for a normal recession out of the water, so we can't discount that. But I do think, like Madeline's saying, like, this is something that the agency is going to have to overcome as they embark on this process. But I do want to take a second. We're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes as well, so please think about those. But I also want to think about, we're talking about this is a 5-year project and thinking about what would success actually look like. So maybe, Daniela, for you, if you look out 5 years from now to the current end of the EDD next time, like, how will you gauge whether the state has pulled this off and whether things are making a tangible improvement?
Yeah, I think a mass overhaul would be ideal in 5 years. And I think that while EDD is working through the steps of EDD Next, that means the legislature, advocates, and others need to be involved in deciding on what fundamental changes we want to make to the program to make it respond to our community needs. So expanding eligibility, as I said, to undocumented workers, making sure it's clearer for caregivers and those providing childcare. The guidelines are clearer for those who have a disability and need to transition between job opportunities. There are many ways that the program can be clarified and expanded to respond to our current system. And so that's the main way that I will gauge success in 5 years is looking at that 50% of unemployed. Are we that don't access unemployment? Are we closer to 100%? Are we getting to a point where people are able to access the program with ease and understand when they are and aren't eligible, and that agrees with what EDD believes in terms of their eligibility, so that when they apply, if they're denied, they understand why. And that they're able to do that quickly. So I also think that a big marker for success, and hopefully we won't have to deal with it in the next 5 years, is if there is another time of large-scale unemployment, that we aren't relying on the federal government for assistance. The only reason that our unemployment system was at all successful in preventing poverty during the pandemic was the tack on of the federal programs that provided an extra $600 or $300 per week. And that's what made it economically feasible for those who had to rely on it week to week. So those are the kinds of changes that we would need to see, is making those changes here within California. Despite it being a jointly run program between the federal and state government, we have a lot of control over how it's administered here. And I think we shouldn't shirk our responsibilities to protect California and our own economy as part of the unemployment insurance system.
And Michael, you mentioned that some of this, it's like not just an EDD issue in terms of thinking about how to modernize and some of these things. But is there anything you would add in terms of how you will, again, gauge whether EDD Next, like whether it is different this time around, or other thoughts on things that we...
No, I think it's good. You're following in depth, and Daniela's following in depth, and the advocates, because it is a 5-year project. There should be change. There are examples I think we've all seen in terms of the private sector firms in which call centers work well. You call Anthem, at least you're able to get through to someone. And so, again, the system was greatly overwhelmed. We're likely to see at some point higher unemployment. So you're right, Danielle, we need to be prepared. But I think it is important to keep, that's why your work is important. Your work is important in terms of continuing to monitor it. And
What about if something happens shorter term? Like if we're talking recession in the coming years, how big of a concern is that?
I think they're moving as quickly, EDD's moving as quickly as it can, but it's, as you point out in your writing, it's a multi-year project. It takes time to improve these systems. I would add also what Daniela said. This is a state-federal program. So EDD can't just do what it wants. You could imagine a system, Daniela, in which anyone could get unemployment system. But that's not our system. And EDD doesn't have that discretion to say, oh, we're going to, or the state to say, we're going to open up unemployment insurance to anyone. Right now, the rate is less than 50% for a number of reasons, but a lot of people just aren't eligible. Maybe they should be, independent contractors and others, but they're not eligible.
There was a bill last year to expand access to undocumented workers. Have either of you heard about a new version of that bill? Or?
Continues. It was held, so SB 227, the excluded worker bill carried by Senator Durazo.
State would pay for that. I mean, but they're in other words, EDD works under certain federal, and EDD gets a lot of money from the federal government, and if it doesn't meet these, that money is at stake. So it's just one other complexity, but the general point is a true one. It needs, this modernization program, I think, has a good game plan, but it's also important that you and everyone in this room continue to monitor it.
Yeah, right. And Madeline, you've been on an interesting road since all of this. So you joined a class action lawsuit against Bank of America. And I'm curious, as you think in retrospect about this kind of whirlwind, what would closure on this look like? Like, what are you looking for out of this?
I mean, for me, it is simple, just compensation for everything that happened. It was one of the worst experiences of my life. I guess I did receive some kind of compensation. Danielle was nice to explain to me what it was for, because I just got this very confusing letter in the mail saying, here's a check for something, and it was for $500.
What was that, Danielle?
Yeah.
So I'm not on the Bank of America case,
Right.
but what I understand is that Bank of America is going through the cases that it ID'd as fraud and paying out what it should have paid.
Yeah, for me, I think it was they were paying out compensation for what they felt that I was owed, and I think considering the amount of money, $5,000 and just everything else, I know, like mental health and damages is kind of one of those things that's thrown a lot of like, what does that even mean and stuff like that. But it really was like the worst time of my life. And I just feel like with everything that happened, like a random check for like $500 to me is not closure. And as for like wider closure, I think just getting a system that really works. Like I understand that EDD and this new program, EDD Next, have a lot of hurdles to go over, and there's a lot of things that have to happen. And I guess I just want to have a system that does the things. Like if someone's wants unemployment, they should get unemployment. Like it feels like so simple to say. I don't even like that Bank of America, honestly, was kind of in charge of giving me the money. And you said that like another bank is coming in to kind
Money
of take
Network
over.
is the new contract.
Money Network. I mean, like for me, I just feel like Bank of America or whoever, these are companies that like their job is to make money, like they're for-profit companies. I just don't feel like an entity like that should be in charge of giving people money if the goal of the company is to make money. Like why did they have such not great debit cards? Like why were there, like
Right. Are there other states that you're aware of, Danielle or Michael, where the state runs the payment, or is this all something that's mostly been contracted out? That's sort of the norm now, as far as you're aware.
The norm is certainly to have another processor of the money. I'm not sure specifically about all the states, but I think to Madeline's point, one of the legacies of the pandemic, and even before that, was the trust in the EDD and in unemployment insurance as a safety net program. So I think many people who dealt with EDD during the pandemic, certainly the 24,000 people we spoke to in the first year of the pandemic, had lost their trust in the department to pay benefits timely and to be able to rely on it as a safety net program. And I think as we see EDD Next be rolled out, regaining that trust is going to be crucial. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because no matter what technology improvements happen, what things are changed, if people don't know about that and don't see the shift at EDD in terms of the way they administer the benefits, then people won't turn to EDD for their times of need and won't try to access it, because they'll remember how long it took them the last time and how it failed them. So I think that will be an important component going forward.
Yeah, Michael.
When I started, you used to go into the EDD office. This was back in the 60s, 70s. And you filed for EDD, for unemployment insurance. You used to go in the office in person and file, and you could talk to someone. And then the system evolved. Then in the 80s, we became more of a phone system. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, migrated to the web. So the system has moved. It's improved in terms of I think, accessibility for most people. It has lost that one-to-one. And, I think the best what we can hope for going forward is that this new system, EDD Next, works well. And
Yeah.
I think it will be an improvement. Again, there are a lot of other issues, starting the top one, especially in Sacramento this year, the funding of the $20 billion deficit. and these other issues of complexity.
And that's been an interesting one. I can't find any legislators that are really like super gung ho on that.
I think there are going to
think
be
somebody will
a
step-
number of bills, and the question becomes, who pays for this?
And just to plug, we have bill language for any legislator who would like to bring this forward. I think we've thought very critically and talked to many stakeholders about what's needed to improve the system. And, we agree completely with Michael that this is the time to fix that foundation, to make sure that the fund is solvent, to make sure we're able to pay those benefits. EDD is focused on the internal improvements, the processing, and all of that. So from the outside, we're able to change the framework of the system to make sure it remains solvent.
Right.
And you're right in terms of the modernization is the key thing, the starting point. Answer the phones. But beyond that, the system goes back to the 1930s. It needs to be overhauled in other fundamental ways: reemployment, the adversarial nature, the complexity, a number of other ways that the system UI needs to be overhauled in the
Just
state.
a few things to deal with. Well, I do want to open it up. We've been getting some questions in from online, but Evelyn in the back of the room has a microphone. If you can raise your hand if you have a question, here in the front.
You guys have done a great job kind of outlining that EDD needs an improvement in its user interface and in cybersecurity. But what you haven't addressed, which really concerns me, is the funding issue. So did you say that EDD had $20 billion in the 1980s? Let me finish this. Most insurance companies have fund management groups. So if I had $20 billion back in the 1980s, even if I paid out a huge chunk of it in unemployment insurance, that $20 billion would have grown to $1 trillion or $500 billion. So who is managing the money, the funding that goes into EDD, and how could they have such deficient math skills that they couldn't figure out that they were going to be $20 billion in the hole? And maybe that's part of being a politician in California.
EDD had a surplus of $6.5 billion in the early 2000s. Then, at that time, the maximum weekly amount was about $240 a week. There was a decision made to raise that weekly amount up to $450 over a 4-year period. So you start to raise the wage replacement rate. So you start doing that, you're paying out more money. So the reserve then goes down. Now, it did, during the Great Recession, we went into deficit, but the deficit corrected itself over the next 6 years because the economy improved, we had more jobs, more money was coming into the fund. So it was a self-correcting. But now, with the pandemic, we're at 20 billion, and it's going the wrong way, at least for the first year. That's the one of the interesting dynamics. Well, the fund is self-managed. It's not like a pension fund in which you make investments. The fund is
The tax rate is set by a combination of federal and state law. So the way that it's funded primarily is through an employer-paid tax. And so that is what needs to be changed in order to increase the amount that comes in. So if you want to keep benefits high or stable towards what the economy is, then the taxation rate is what needs to be changed, and that's set by law. So there's nobody that says, okay, premiums are gonna go up, and 1 year you can just increase the premiums. The taxable wage base in California is at the federal minimum of $7,000. So only the first $7,000 of earnings for any individual employee in California is only taxed for the first $7,000. And that's been set since the early 1980s and hasn't gone up.
Yeah, and California is a real outlier in that regard. Other folks have changed it. Michael, I'm curious because we would be talking then about raise business taxes. How do you think that would fly?
Yeah, somebody has to pay for it. So we may want to raise the taxable wage base from 7,000. It is a low one, but you want to raise taxes on. The trade-off is you're raising employer taxes, There's a whole other issue, there's another session, Lauren, about why it is California has continually higher unemployment rate than virtually every other state now, except for Nevada. So, I mean, there are trade-offs. It still may make sense. There still may be ways of doing it, but there are trade-offs in terms of cost of each employee.
Did you have a thought, Madeline?
Yeah, I'm very pro taxing employers. I want to say they should tax them as much as we can. I think for me, maybe I'm just not an intelligent woman, but like when I hear things like deficit and like where's the money and all this stuff, like you can't just have this money appear. I always just, and again, maybe I'm looking at the wrong things, but I'm always seeing on like the news and all this stuff, these large amounts of money going to things that don't make a lot of sense to me, and I don't understand why it's so easy for that money to go to a thing that I've never heard of versus like something going to here which helps people to, to be frank, like not die, like I mean, I'm not up on economics and things like that, but that's just my perspective.
Well, there is one question here. We got a couple online questions about this. So California is also facing an overall budget deficit, but as far as we know, the funding for EDD Next has been preserved, correct? Okay. Do we have other questions in the room? Okay, I can go back to a couple questions we got online then. So this would probably be for Daniela. This is sort of a question about ongoing issues. We got a commenter who said, both of my daughters filed claims and tried numerous times to reach out or get an appointment. Is there still a backlog? Will this backlog be part of the overhaul? People pay into these systems and need these claims to be paid so they do not become homeless.
Yeah, so I think that the issue with eligibility interviews, which it sounds like this person has experienced, largely there is not a backlog. So if you apply to EDD, they will make an eligibility determination on your what we call the initial application, so your first time applying to determine your eligibility for benefits, fairly timely, depending on the issue and whether your employer responds and whether you have to contest it. The main backlog is with the appeals. So if you are denied and want to contest that determination, there's still quite a lengthy appeal timeline. So I don't have the current numbers, but it was at about 6 months when I checked in August. So that's the main time barrier in terms of applications.
Yeah, and we got a sort of related question. What recourse is available to individuals who are negatively impacted, in many cases lost housing or became very in debt as a direct result of an EDD failure? Should we put into place compensation or relief options for the next time this agency fails Californians? Madeline, I'd like to dig for a second into how you mentioned, and a lot of folks have said this to me, I felt like I was getting ping-ponged between the agencies. I didn't know who to call. So who outside of the state did you go to for help? Are there tips you would share with other folks? Or?
Yeah, I got in contact with a bunch of different organizations. One of them was DSA, and they led me to talk to my local politicians, which is, I think, the only reason I did end up getting the money back was
This
that
is like your state
my
representative.
state
in
representative.
Burbank,
Yeah, so just city representative, like not even like state
local
representative,
official,
just
okay.
local city of Burbank representative. I talked to somebody, I emailed them saying, hey, this is a problem, all this stuff going on, and I think because like I just kept hounding them and anybody that would hear me, I think that's why I am one of the lucky ones that did get the money back. Because as you were saying, like a lot of people have not reached that step, and I just, it's not great that you have to like go that far and make that many calls to people that maybe you've never even heard of, in your life to make it happen. But that is what I had to do. And that was what made me ultimately successful, not getting a hold of Bank of America or EDD. I'd like to stress that. It was getting hold of like elected officials that got the problem solved, at least in my experience.
Right, that's helpful. And Daniela, you still run a legal clinic, and there are other groups out there as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's still relief available. Members of the legislature can still escalate, as we call it, escalate cases to EDD for individual resolution. We do it at our office. We send cases to EDD both on UI as well as SDI and paid family leave when there are issues. And these are issues that are not explained by their regular procedures generally, because usually people can go through the system and navigate it on their own. They can get through generally to EDD, and they can, go through the benefits process. But there are times where we get these cases where we're not understanding why something is happening, and there may be some sort of system glitch or a technology issue or other problems that hopefully will be addressed by EDD next. But in the meantime, individual resolution is important.
Yeah, and the one other thing we got multiple questions about, and Michael, you've already addressed this a little bit, is the staffing. So we had folks who say, will EDD hire more staff to process claims? They were always understaffed before the pandemic. Were they understaffed by choice or because it was hard to find people to hire? You mentioned that maybe understaffing. What, can you just take that one on?
Well, I don't think it was understaffed before the pandemic, because there wasn't really a backlog. And what changed, obviously, with the enormous increase in claims during 2020. And again, you can't just put someone in as a claims adjuster. They need months of training at least. And so it took time for people to get on board and
It's like an 800-page manual, I think.
well, it's some lengthy, and it. So I mean, I think, Madeline, again, your experience was common. It's just a complex system, takes time to. But I think the staffing issue is less. I think, as Madeline pointed out, EDD next, if it goes well.
Right. If I can just
No,
say,
jump in.
like, I think one of the things that technology has to figure out is that when you do everything you're supposed to do, like make the phone call, get the technology, get to the people that are doing it, and all of a sudden you get to a point where they just say, no, you're denied, and you're like, why? Because it seems like would be easy to accept, and they're like, that's
just
the
it.
kind of, well, that's what I want fixed. That was my problem.
Communication.
Well, but
Yeah.
you can, but it may not. It's not a technology problem.
Is that the back end?
Well, again, I'm only
adjudicating?
talking
No,
about
this
my
is the
specific experience.
eligibility issue thing, because if EDD is saying you're not eligible, it's because they've run you through the system, they've asked you the questions, and they're saying you don't meet the guidelines. And so that's why, and this is why you have to appeal, and some of those folks are ultimately eligible and some of them aren't. But clarifying, and this is also is why staffing can be easily improved. The more we simplify eligibility and we make it apply regardless of all these technicalities, it will make it easier to onboard new staffing members in times of crisis. It will make it easier for those staff members to make the correct determinations the first time, and allow the benefits to be processed easier.
I just really want to clarify that I was actually accepted by unemployment. Like, that wasn't the problem. I was eligible, I was accepted, they did give me the money. The problem was that I was frauded this money, and Bank of America or whoever chose to rescind a decision to believe me and I didn't lose or stop being part of unemployment. In fact, like I mentioned, a bunch of money was going to a negative account that I couldn't get transferred anywhere else. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was that $5,000 was stolen, then given to me, and then taken back by the organization saying we're choosing not to. So that's the kind of issue that I would want resolved. So things like that don't happen again.
Yeah. Well, certainly a pretty crazy legacy we're leaving behind from the last 3 years.
But you always have the tension between, as long as you have an UI system that doesn't say anyone's eligible, that has certain eligibility, you always have that tension of speed of resolving claims versus fraud. And my sense is that you're not talking about a lot of fraud with individuals. It's morphed during the pandemic into more organized, but there's always that tension. And one positive thing, and one way of putting it, is that the pandemic, in the early 2000s, nobody took fraud seriously. You'd go to the Capitol and, Tom McClintock was the only one who wanted to talk about fraud.
Well, I see our dear leader over here, Neil. I think you're right, Michael. We could have a whole follow-up conversation about this, but thank you.
And this is my least favorite time, right? When we've now proven in the last 2 minutes, there's another hour or 2 or 3 to talk about this. It's a big story. It's a big project. It is something that, we have committed to doing the kind of journalism on that's going to help us understand it. It's a long-term effort for Lauren and the rest of our staff. Thanks so much to all 3 of you for coming today. Really appreciate your thoughts and sharing your stories. We are a nonprofit, member-driven organization. We do this work through your support. I want to especially thank Lucas Public Affairs has been supporting us, and the other folks who've been donating as members, and invite you to come to these things often. We'll be doing a lot more of these this year, and we will be picking up this conversation again for sure. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.